Greetings and hello. The title of my talk is Golden Spikes Won't Pin Down Dragons. I made this section 1 as it is the beginning portion of a much larger and longer performance lecture that I usually give. Sorry to the students that I've been working with. This is kind of going to be a refresher of what you saw already. And so what it's going to do is visually walk you through the progression of my work while entangling theory, poetry, and critical thinking. And I also provide a slide at the end with kind of all the citations so you don't have to try and write things or sort out who is saying what in this. But first, what I must do is recognize my position in this room. I'm a white, non-binary Western body that comes from a history of colonialism and settlerism. I want to recognize the privileges we have to be in this space today and for the ability I have been given to speak with you. I'm also recognizing that I've been invited on the land by a colonial institution. I am thankful for this invitation to speak and conduct what has been after an intense week of workshop with the Metals Department students. And I must also give a thank you to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies and the Swedish Arts Grants Committee, both in visual and dance, for giving me the time to develop this lecture. I really wish I had a mouse. So what I do is I also always start off a talk with initiation of a quote by Wu Tsang, who was trying to consider how to give a performance based off of Paris's Burning at MoMA and the conundrum of a queer body performing in front of an audience and whether to turn it down and be the angry queer or how do you give that but also create space of solidarity and empathy. So if you want to witness this, please first recognize we exist. In order to fall apart as complex beings, we need to first be able to live as one. I speak with and not for. I speak in solidarity in attempts to build systems of empathy to raise critical awareness of not only what sits in front of us, but how the I is linked to the them in attempts to reclaim the we as a means of productive growth. Our privilege is a fulcrum, and I ask you to consider who and what you leverage with it. Jewelry is quite possibly the last thing we need in this world today. Jewelry is a luxury commodity that teeters in the lines of indulgence, decadence, and frivolity. It shifts categories and can be labeled as craft, fashion, art, and design. Jewelry is messy, at times hard to define, and can be next to impossible to explain to someone on the street or in a commuter train in a short sentence. As jewelers, we need to explain why we use contemporary, art, or some other adjective placed in front of the word jewelry, and to address what it means when we do not. The jewelry world in relation to the gallery is hard to explain to an onlooker who does not have privileged access to our microcosmic world. Within the Western jewelry world, we are asked to explain what we are doing and why it is important to anyone but ourselves. Jewelry is a menace. Jewelry demands that we think of bodies, how they work, how they look, and how they are represented. It is a form that requires the body to be taken into consideration, even in the realm of the unwearable. Jewelry is a slippery word that can roll itself in adornment, and as soon as we think we have a grasp on it, it slips away with a single exhaled breath. Yet jewelry may be what we need in this world today. Jewelry may be messy, and at times it is hard to define, but at other moments can open up critical conversation with someone on the street or commuter train. Jewelry calls for something more than a short sentence. Jewelry can be an instigator to begin to unpack conversations around luxury commodities and ideas of indulgence, decadence, and frivolity. It queerly shifts categories. Sometimes it is craft, fashion, art, and design. Jewelry challenges conventions and categorical boxes by jumping and dancing between, on, and around them. Jewelry can be a picket sign carried throughout the day. It can be a whisper or a scream that does not require a single spoken word. Jewelry asks us to consider privileges of the body. Jewelry needs a body to be understood. Jewelry can be a curatorial and conservation nightmare to conventional colonial systems, including the museum. Jewelry is an activist for new systems to understand work that needs to be touched or worn to be completed. Jewelry requires consideration of work and where it is completed, from making to displaying to wearing, buying in the transactions and transformations that occur in these places and phases. Jewelry asks us to consider size, shape, gender, sexuality, and ability among other aspects of bodies. Jewelry solicits us to consider what a homeland is and how and when we draw lines and construct walls around nationality and nation states in a time when only privileged bodies can easily traverse between borders into academies. Jewelry demands us to consider the importance and function of the institution and the academy. Jewelry has the potential to ask for progress, for critical thinking, and for the consideration of diversity. We must look at criticism and recognize not just our own imbrication in the object or the cultural moment, but also the performative nature of any action or stance we might be taking in relation to it, writes Erit Rogoff in What is a Theorist? Criticality puts us in a position to use theory to unravel the very ground on which we stand. Criticality can introduce questions and uncertainties in those places where formerly there has been some seeming consensus about what one did and how one went about it. Jewelry has the potential to address a multitude of critical social issues when open to productive criticism and discussion. This does not mean that all jewelry needs to be loud or to become political. What it does mean is that it is time to address our current reality. It is time for critical dialogue to consider what and why we are producing objects and their possibilities when they leave the making space or studio. We must be willing to have a productive conversation that involves critique. As Bell Hooks states, the point of being in touch with a transcendent reality is that we struggle for justice, all the while realizing that we are always more than our race, class, or sex. As Baldwin states, freaks are called freaks and are treated as they are treated, in the main, abominably, because they are human beings who cause us to echo, deep within us, our most profound terrors and desires. Most of us, however, do not appear to be freaks, though we are rarely what we appear to be. We are the most part visibly male or female, our social roles defined by our sexual equipment. But we are all androgynous, not only because we are all born of a woman impregnated by the seed of a man, but because each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the other, male and female, female and male, white and black and white. We are a part of each other. Many of my countrymen appear to find this exact finding inconvenient and even unfair, and so, very often, do I. But none of us can do anything about it. But this, by no means, sums up the state or the possibility of the human being in whom the awakening of desire fuels imagination and in whom imagination fuels desire. In other words, it is not possible for the human being to be as simple as a stallion or a mare, because the human imagination is perpetually required to examine, control, and redefine reality, of which we must assume ourselves to be the center and the key. Nature and revelation are perpetually challenging each other. This relentless tension is one of the keys to human history, to what is known as the human condition. Now, I can speak only of the Western world and must rely on my own experience. But the simple truth of the universal duality, this perpetual possibility of communion and completion, seems so alarming that I have watched it lead to addiction, despair, death, and madness. Nowhere have I seen this panic more vividly than in my own country and in my generation. I've come to build a practice that at times is coherent and at others a massive entanglement of clarities that come to form chaos. To be clear, I have an extreme anxiety about where my practice sits. I have never been fond of performance and add an exclamation to the notion of collaboration, a process in which I must give up my control. My practice is surrounded by possibility and potential, both for the ability to form new conversations with the element of error and disrespect always looming. I take the risk of the error and place myself into a state of vulnerability in order to learn and to share. The title of this talk, Golden Spikes Won't Pin Down Dragons, comes from the use of this quote from Baldwin's essay, Here Be Dragons, and the possibilities that exist in the space of the non-binary or queer. Here Be Dragons means dangerous or unexplored territories, an imitation of a medieval practice of putting illustrations of dragons, sea monsters, and other mythological creatures on uncharted areas or maps where potential dangers were thought to exist. A golden spike then comes in, as Karen Youssef unpicks in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, as the necessity to mark geological transformations, the need to pin down to a state and time of something clearly happening. What is actually the case is a clear danger of the spiking forming a barrier, to declare certain bodies as valid and others as invalid, to validate a human experience as the human experience. By declaring the Anthropocene and its effects, we are saying that those affected before this era do not matter. What it is the colonial body that is the body. This is when the usage of us, we, I, and them become muddled. As Youssef states, the end of this world has already happened for some subjects and is the prerequisite for the possibility of imagining, living, and breathing again for others. In my bio and statement, I declare jewelry as a terroristic act to westernized and colonial institutions. It requires the consideration of the body. In a time when corporations are considered humans and bodies are turned into numbers and profits under capitalism, it is time we look at the global issues and parallel them, particularly my interest to craft. Jewelry allows what Tina Camp prefers in regards to images as a performance of a future that hasn't yet happened but must. It is an attachment to belief in what should be true, what impedes us to realize that aspiration. It is power to imagine beyond current fact and to envision that which is not, but must be. It's a politics of prefiguration that involves living the future now, as imperative rather than subjective, as a striving for the future you want to see right now in the present. My work centers around the idea of the chimera, the mythical beast that also exists in our genetics. It is formed in my independent studio practice and is genetically mutated on into collaboration, writing, and curating. The chimera exists in the present and pushes into the future. Again, Youssef states, futurity through the motion of tense, to offer an interiority possibility that cuts through coloniality as a counter-aesthetic that refuses the inhuman in its codified state as property. Rather, the intimacies with the inhuman forged through an aesthetics of chaos are reworked in new poetic grammars to create an insurgent geology of belonging, one that refuses capture by geological forces and redirects their non-stratified forces as a sense of possibility. The questions we are then confronted with in life are the questions in my practice, never simple, never clear, never neat, and/or tidy. If the Anthropocene prompts a recognition of the changes in quality of the subjective force of geology, it must do so at a material level in the way that geological relational structures sustain, condition, and constrain agency. These material history sediments and arrive in the now as a continued challenge to presence in the context of erasure. They arrive as a geophysics of sense. Again, turning to Youssef. Futurity is, for me, not a question of hope, though it is certainly inescapable, intertwines with the idea of aspiration. To me, it is crucial to think about futurity through a notion of tense. What is the tense of a Black feminist future? It is a tense of interiority, a tense relationship to an idea of possibility, and is neither innocent nor naive, nor is it necessary, heroic, or intentional. It is often humble and strategic, subtle and discerning. It is devious and exacting. It's not always loud and demanding. It is frequently quiet and opportunistic, dogged and disruptive. So how do we look at this and think about it with this? To close and open the room for questions, I leave you with Karen Yusof again. The key to the future lies in the present, and that the present is not just future-oriented, but that the future is already inscripted in the present, already bounding with the material recombinations of the bad material formulations of the past secreted into future possibilities. And I believe that as makers, writers, curators, wearers, and viewers, it is our responsibility to always examine and look for possibility. Thank you.